For most of modern history, debt has been treated as a temporary problem, something to manage, something to refinance, something that could eventually be paid down with discipline, growth, or reform. But when you step back from individual countries, individual crises, or individual decades, a different picture appears. Debt does not behave like a mistake, it behaves like a structure. Every modern economy carries debt. Every government runs deficits. Every crisis increases borrowing rather than reducing it. And after every recovery, the debt level settles higher than before. This is not an accident, and it is not the result of poor leadership repeating the same error. It is the result of how the system itself is built. To understand why debt can never go down, we need to abandon the idea that debt is merely money borrowed in the past. Debt is not just a record of spending. It is a requirement of the system's survival. In modern economies, money and debt are inseparable. One cannot exist without the other. When new money enters the system, it almost always enters as debt, a loan, a bond, a credit obligation. Every unit of new currency is matched by an obligation to repay more than was created. That more is interest. And this is where the mathematical trap begins. If the entire money supply is created through lending, but repayment requires more money than exists, the system cannot fully close the loop. There is always a shortfall. That shortfall must be filled by new borrowing, which means the system does not move toward zero debt, it moves away from it. At first, this growth feels manageable. Economic expansion masks the problem. Productivity rises, trade expands, tax revenues grow, debt ratios stabilize or even decline for a time. This creates the illusion that debt is under control. But what is actually happening is postponement. Old debt is not being eliminated, it is being rolled forward, replaced with new debt at lower rates, longer durations, or larger scales. The system survives not by paying debt off, but by expanding faster than the interest burden for as long as possible. This works only while growth outpaces obligations. Eventually, it does not. At that point, the system faces a choice that every empire, state, and monetary order has faced before. Cut spending and collapse demand. Default and destroy credibility. Or borrow even more. History shows that the third option is always chosen, because default is politically catastrophic, and austerity is socially destabilizing. Borrowing delays consequences. It preserves the appearance of stability. It buys time. And time is the most valuable political currency of all. This is why debt never goes down. Not because leaders are irrational, but because the system rewards delay and punishes restraint. Each generation inherits the accumulated obligations of the previous one, not as a moral failure, but as a structural condition. As debt grows, it changes the behavior of institutions. Governments begin to depend on continuous borrowing not just to fund emergencies, but to fund normal operations. Interest payments become permanent line items. Entire markets emerge solely to trade obligations rather than produce goods. Financial systems adapt to this reality. Banks, pension funds, insurers, and asset managers come to rely on government debt as a foundational asset. Removing it would collapse balance sheets across the economy. Debt stops being a burden that can be lifted. It becomes the load-bearing beam. At this stage, reducing debt is no longer a policy option. It is a systemic risk. Any serious attempt to shrink total debt would remove money from circulation.
That contraction would trigger recessions, defaults, unemployment, and political backlash. So instead, the system does the opposite. It stabilizes through expansion. New debt is issued to cover old debt. New programs are justified to sustain demand. New crises are absorbed through emergency spending. Each cycle leaves the system larger, slower, and more fragile than before.
This means repayment is not neutral. Repayment destroys money. In a small, contained system, this might be manageable, but at scale, repayment becomes contraction. Widespread debt reduction removes liquidity from the economy, slowing activity, reducing income, and increasing defaults elsewhere. The system therefore develops an immune response. When repayment accelerates, new credit must expand to offset it. When private borrowing slows, public borrowing increases. When households retrench, governments stimulate. Debt fills the gaps left by debt. This is why attempts to pay down debt at the system level repeatedly fail. The act of reducing obligations creates the conditions that force new obligations into existence. The same dynamic appears at the government level, but with even higher stakes. Governments do not repay debt the way households do. They refinance it. Maturing obligations are rolled into new bonds. Old promises are replaced with longer promises. The principal remains. The interest compounds. In theory, a government could run sustained surpluses and reduce its total obligations. In practice, doing so would require removing more money from the economy than the system can tolerate. Taxes rise, spending falls, demand collapses, growth slows, political support evaporates. Before long, the pressure to reverse course becomes overwhelming. This is not a failure of will. It is a feedback loop. Debt supports demand. Demand supports growth. Growth supports tax revenue. Tax revenue supports debt service. Break any link in that chain, and the entire structure destabilizes. Over time, interest itself becomes the dominant force. At low levels, interest is manageable. It rewards savers, disciplines borrowers, and allocates capital. At high levels of aggregate debt, interest becomes extraction. A growing share of economic output flows not toward production, wages, or innovation, but toward servicing past obligations. Money circulates faster between governments and creditors than between employers and workers. This changes incentives across the system. Policies are judged less by whether they create long-term value and more by whether they maintain short-term stability. Growth is measured not by productivity, but by asset prices. Success becomes synonymous with avoiding collapse rather than building resilience. As debt accumulates, the system grows increasingly sensitive to shocks. Small disruptions require large interventions. Minor recessions demand massive stimulus. Each response increases the baseline level of debt required to maintain equilibrium. What once would have been considered emergency measures become normal operating procedure. At this stage, debt is no longer a tool. It is the operating system. Attempts to escape this reality usually take one of three forms. The first is optimism, faith that future growth, innovation, or demographic change will solve the problem. This belief appears in every cycle, usually near the peak. The second is moralization, framing debt as irresponsibility, corruption, or excess. While these may exist, removing them does not remove the structural mechanics. The third is reform, new rules, new limits, new frameworks. These can slow the process, but they do not reverse it unless the underlying creation of money through debt is altered.
History shows that none of these approaches eliminates the problem. They merely reshape its trajectory. The reason is simple. A debt-based monetary system requires continuous expansion to remain stable. Stability is not achieved by balance, but by motion. As long as debt grows in line with expectations, the system holds together. The moment growth falters, the system demands intervention. And intervention always takes the same form: more debt. This is the quiet truth behind modern finance. Debt is not a temporary deviation from a healthy system. It is the condition the system needs to function. Which raises a far more unsettling question. If debt can never go down without breaking the system, what happens when it can no longer go up? The moment debt can no longer expand smoothly, the system enters its most dangerous phase. This phase does not begin with collapse. It begins with strain. Growth slows, but obligations remain fixed. Interest does not pause simply because productivity weakens. Payments still come due. Expectations still exist. Markets still demand confidence. When expansion stalls, the system responds by changing the rules. This is where monetary authorities enter the foreground. Central banks exist, in theory, to stabilize prices and smooth economic cycles. In practice, they become the managers of systemic debt stress. When debt levels are low, interest rates can rise and fall without major consequences. When debt levels are high, even small increases become destabilizing. Servicing costs spike, asset prices wobble, defaults threaten to cascade.
At that point, interest rates stop being a policy tool and become a constraint. They cannot rise without breaking something. So, instead of allowing the system to contract, authorities intervene to keep debt expanding. Liquidity is injected, rates are lowered, balance sheets grow. New mechanisms are created to absorb risk that markets can no longer carry on their own. Each intervention is justified as temporary. Each one becomes permanent. This process does not eliminate debt, it transforms it. Private debt migrates toward public balance sheets. Risk that once belonged to banks shifts to central institutions. Losses are socialized to preserve systemic stability. The system survives, but at a cost. Price signals weaken. Capital allocation becomes distorted. Asset values detach from underlying productivity. Inequality widens as those closest to financial assets benefit first from expansion. Debt continues to grow, but its quality deteriorates. More borrowing is required to generate the same amount of growth. More stimulus is needed to achieve the same stabilization. Each cycle delivers diminishing returns. This is the hallmark of late-stage debt dynamics. At this stage, the system becomes extremely sensitive to confidence, because when debt is too large to repay, the leaf becomes the collateral. As long as creditors believe obligations will be honored, the system functions. As long as markets believe intervention will continue, stability holds. As long as participants believe tomorrow will look roughly like today, momentum carries forward. But confidence is not infinite. It erodes quietly. Not all at once, but through repeated stress events. Each crisis resolved through larger intervention teaches the system a dangerous lesson: that the solution to debt is always more debt. Eventually, expectations shift. Participants begin to question not whether debts will be paid, but how. Not whether stability will be preserved, but at what cost. Not whether intervention will occur, but whether it can keep pace. This is when inflationary pressure emerges, not as a policy choice,
but as an outcome. When money creation accelerates faster than productive capacity, purchasing power erodes. Prices rise. Savings lose value. Debt becomes easier to service in nominal terms, but harder to escape in real terms. This creates a quiet transfer from savers to borrowers, from wage earners to asset holders, from the future to the present. Inflation is not an accident in a debt-saturated system. It is one of the few remaining release valves. By reducing the real value of obligations, inflation allows the system to continue without explicit default. It preserves nominal stability while quietly altering the distribution of losses. This is why inflation is often tolerated, even denied, until it becomes impossible to ignore. At this point, policymakers face a narrowing corridor. Tighten too aggressively, and the debt structure fractures. Loosen too much, and currency credibility erodes. There is no painless path forward, only trade-offs. And every trade-off shifts pressure somewhere else in the system. What is often misunderstood is that none of this requires incompetence or conspiracy. These outcomes emerge naturally once debt reaches a scale where repayment is no longer feasible. The system does not fail because it is mismanaged. It fails because it is mathematically constrained. Debt can never go down in a debt-based system without triggering contraction. But debt also cannot rise forever without undermining the value of the system that supports it. This is the paradox at the center of modern finance, and it leads to the final, unavoidable phase. The moment when expansion no longer restores confidence, only postpones its loss. That is when history shows the pattern accelerates, and why the end of the cycle, once it begins, moves far faster than anyone expects. To see where this cycle leads, it helps to step back from theory and look at how it has unfolded repeatedly across history. The names change, the technologies change, the institutions change, but the sequence does not. Every large debt-based system moves through the same stages. It begins with productive expansion. Debt grows, but it fuels real output. Infrastructure is built, trade expands, standards of living rise. Borrowing feels justified because tomorrow genuinely looks larger than today. Then comes saturation. Growth slows, not because the system is failing, but because it has matured. The easiest gains are already captured. Productivity improvements become harder. Returns diminish. Debt, however, does not slow with growth. It keeps accumulating because commitments made during expansion do not disappear when expansion fades. At this stage, borrowing shifts purpose. Debt no longer primarily funds growth. It funds maintenance.
It fills budget gaps. It stabilizes demand. It prevents contraction. Borrowing becomes defensive rather than generative. This is the point where fragility quietly enters the system. From the outside, everything still appears functional. Markets operate, institutions hold, daily life continues, but the margin for error narrows dramatically. Shocks that would once have been absorbed now require intervention. Normal business cycles become crises. Stability depends increasingly on confidence rather than fundamentals. As debt grows relative to productive capacity, the system begins to rely on perception. Perception that obligations will be honored. Perception that authorities remain in control. Perception that tomorrow will resemble today. This reliance on belief is not psychological weakness, it is structural necessity. Because when debts exceed the ability to repay them through growth, they can only be sustained through rolling confidence.
At this point, two things tend to happen simultaneously. First, complexity increases. New financial instruments are created to manage risk. New policies are introduced to smooth volatility. New narratives emerge to explain why this time is different. Each layer adds apparent sophistication, but also opacity. Second, accountability diffuses. Responsibility for outcomes becomes unclear. No single actor controls the system, yet every actor depends on it continuing. Decisions are justified as unavoidable. Alternatives are framed as impossible. The system no longer feels chosen, it feels inherited. This is when debt becomes political. Not because politicians suddenly care more about debt, but because debt now constrains every decision. Budgets are shaped by servicing costs. Policies are filtered through market reactions. Sovereignty becomes conditional. At this stage, the idea of paying debt down becomes almost unthinkable. Reducing debt would require reducing spending or raising taxes enough to contract the economy. Contraction would increase defaults. Defaults would undermine confidence. Undermined confidence would raise borrowing costs. The attempt to escape the cycle would accelerate it. So instead, the system leans further into continuation. Longer maturities, lower real rates, implicit guarantees, explicit backstops. Each measure is rational in isolation. Together, they push the system deeper into dependence on perpetual expansion. History shows that this phase can last a long time, sometimes decades, which is why it is so often misunderstood. Observers mistake duration for sustainability, stability for health, survival for strength. But the defining feature of this phase is not collapse, it is brittleness. The system functions until it does not, and when it stops functioning, the shift is abrupt. Because debt does not unwind gradually once confidence breaks. It unwinds through repricing, default, inflation, or restructuring, often through several at once. The longer the system avoids adjustment, the more violent the adjustment becomes. This is why late-stage debt cycles always end the same way. Not because leaders want them to. Not because collapse is chosen, but because the available options narrow until none remain. Debt cannot be paid down without contraction. It cannot expand forever without erosion. So the system oscillates between delay and distortion until one overwhelms the other. This is not a failure unique to any country or era. It is a property of debt-based systems at scale, which leads to the final question. If debt cannot go down without breaking the system, and cannot go up forever without breaking trust, what does an ending actually look like? History provides the answer, and it is never as orderly as those inside the system expect. When debt systems finally reach their limit, the ending rarely arrives as a single event. It arrives as a sequence of adjustments that gradually reveal the truth everyone has been avoiding. The first adjustment is usually financial. Markets begin to reprice risk. Assets that were once considered safe start to behave unpredictably. Volatility increases not because participants are irrational, but because assumptions no longer hold. Interest rates no longer reflect growth potential. Asset prices no longer reflect productivity. Valuations no longer reflect reality. They reflect fear. At this stage, policymakers attempt to restore confidence using the tools that worked before. Liquidity is provided. Guarantees are expanded. Rules are relaxed. But the effect is weaker each time. Because confidence, once shaken, does not return easily. The second adjustment is monetary. As debt burdens become unmanageable in real terms, the system turns increasingly toward devaluation. This does not always happen openly. Sometimes it appears as sustained inflation, sometimes as currency weakness, sometimes as financial repression that quietly transfers value away from savers.
The goal is not growth. The goal is relief. By reducing the real value of obligations, the system attempts to reset without admitting failure. Debts remain intact on paper, but their meaning changes. This is why many debt cycles end not with explicit default, but with a loss of purchasing power. The contract is honored nominally, but broken economically. The third adjustment is political. As economic pressure spreads, social tolerance narrows. Policies that once felt technical become deeply personal. Inflation is no longer an abstract statistic. Austerity is no longer a fiscal concept. Trust in institutions weakens as outcomes diverge from promises. This is when legitimacy begins to erode. Not because people suddenly become unreasonable, but because the system can no longer deliver what it implied. Political polarization increases. Blame intensifies. The search for solutions becomes the search for culprits. At this point, reform becomes extremely difficult. Any attempt to impose discipline threatens collapse. Any attempt to delay adjustment deepens distortion. Leadership is trapped between immediate pain and long-term instability. This is why late-stage debt systems often oscillate. Periods of tightening followed by reversal, moments of confidence followed by renewed stress, announcements of normalization followed by emergency measures. Each swing reduces credibility. Eventually, the system reaches the point where expectations change permanently. Participants stop asking when debt will be reduced. They stop asking when balance will return. They begin asking how losses will be distributed. This is the real turning point. Because once the question shifts from sustainability to allocation, the cycle is already ending. From there, the resolution can take different forms. Some systems experience outright default or restructuring. Obligations are written down. Creditors absorb losses. The system resets through recognition of failure. Others resolve through prolonged inflation. Value erodes slowly. Contracts remain intact, but wealth transfers occur quietly over time. Others fragment politically. Monetary systems are replaced. New frameworks emerge. Old promises are abandoned under new names. The form varies. The logic does not. What all endings share is speed. While the buildup can take decades, the resolution often unfolds in years, sometimes less. Once confidence breaks, it does not decay gradually. It collapses. This is why the final phase always feels shocking, even though it was structurally inevitable. And this is where the central insight returns. Debt cannot go down in a debt-based system without causing contraction. But debt also cannot go up forever without undermining the system's credibility. The system survives by postponing this contradiction for as long as possible. Eventually, postponement fails. What follows is not chaos for its own sake. It is rebalancing, abrupt, uneven, and deeply disruptive. History shows that new systems do emerge after these moments, but they emerge only after losses are realized, promises are broken, and illusions are stripped away. The mistake is to believe that this process begins at collapse. In reality, it begins the moment debt becomes untouchable.
That is when the ending is already written. The only uncertainty that remains is timing, and who bears the cost when the system finally adjusts. The reason people consistently underestimate the end of a debt cycle is not ignorance. It is conditioning. Modern systems train participants to believe that stability is permanent as long as institutions exist, as long as markets open tomorrow, as long as payments clear, as long as authority remains visible. But debt cycles do not end when institutions disappear. They end when institutions lose effectiveness. For most of the cycle, problems appear solvable. Each disruption is framed as exceptional. Each response is described as sufficient. Each delay reinforces the belief that delay itself is resolution. This creates a dangerous misreading of time. People assume that because the system survived the last shock, it will survive the next one unchanged. They extrapolate continuity from endurance. History shows this assumption is always wrong. Late-stage systems do not fail because they stop functioning entirely. They fail because they can no longer fulfill the role they promised. Money still exists. Governments still operate. Markets still trade. But outcomes deteriorate. Living standards stagnate. Inequality widens. Trust erodes. At this point, collapse does not look like collapse. It looks like normalization of decline. This is why warning signs are dismissed. Rising intervention is framed as competence. Expanding balance sheets are framed as tools. Persistent distortions are framed as temporary. The system does not announce its limits. It quietly reaches them. Another reason endings are misjudged is scale.
Debt numbers grow so large that they lose meaning. Trillions feel abstract. Ratios feel academic. The human mind adapts by disengaging. But systems do not disengage from arithmetic. Interest compounds whether it is understood or not. Obligations mature whether they are acknowledged or not. Confidence adjusts whether it is discussed or not. The final stage begins when interventions stop restoring normality and merely prevent immediate breakdown. At that point, the system is no longer stabilizing. It is surviving. Survival mode has a distinct pattern. Authorities respond faster and with greater force to smaller triggers. Language shifts from reassurance to justification. Emergency measures are preemptive rather than reactive. Most importantly, options narrow. Choices that once existed no longer do. Raising rates becomes dangerous. Cutting spending becomes destabilizing. Allowing defaults becomes systemic. Every path carries risk, so the system chooses the one that defers recognition the longest. That path is always expansion. More liquidity, more guarantees, more promises. But expansion without confidence does not create strength. It creates dependence. Eventually, participants notice the change. They stop expecting improvement and start planning around deterioration. Behavior shifts quietly. Time horizons shorten. Trust becomes conditional. This is how systems lose momentum, not through panic, but through adaptation. The end of a debt cycle is not the moment markets crash. It is the moment people stop believing the system will recover to something better than the present. From there, outcomes accelerate. Capital seeks safety rather than opportunity. Policy seeks containment rather than progress. Society becomes reactive rather than aspirational.
At this stage, collapse is not a single event to predict. It is a process already underway. This is why debt can never go down. Not because reduction is technically impossible, but because reduction becomes socially, politically, and economically intolerable long before it becomes mathematically necessary. The system chooses distortion over contraction for as long as it can. When distortion no longer works, adjustment arrives anyway, only harsher and faster. This is the final illusion of debt-based systems, that delay equals control. In reality, delay increases fragility. And when the adjustment finally occurs, it does not arrive as a policy decision. It arrives as a loss of belief. That is when debt stops being a number on a balance sheet and becomes a force that reshapes institutions, currencies, and lives. This is not a forecast. It is a pattern. And it is why every debt system that reaches this stage follows the same trajectory, regardless of intent, intelligence, or innovation. Which brings the story to its unavoidable conclusion. If debt cannot go down and cannot go up forever, then the system itself must eventually change. The only remaining question is not whether that change comes. It is how prepared people are when it does. The history of debt cycles offers a sobering lesson. They do not end because someone finally makes the right decision. They do not end because a better policy appears. They end because the structure itself reaches a point where continuation becomes impossible. For most of the cycle, debt feels abstract, a figure on a screen, a ratio in a report, something distant from daily life. But at the end of the cycle, debt becomes tangible. It appears in prices that no longer feel stable, in opportunities that quietly disappear, in systems that still function but no longer serve. This is why the most dangerous moment is not collapse. It is normalization. When people adjust expectations downward and call it realism. When erosion is reframed as resilience. When survival replaces progress as the benchmark of success. Debt systems rarely collapse outwardly before they collapse inwardly. By the time the break becomes visible, the outcome has already been decided. This does not mean the future is predetermined in detail. Paths can differ. Timelines can stretch or compress. The form of adjustment can vary. But the constraint remains. A system built on ever-expanding debt cannot resolve itself through restraint. And it cannot expand forever without hollowing out its own foundation. This is the paradox modern societies inherit. Debt cannot go down because reduction removes the money the system depends on. Debt cannot go up forever because confidence cannot expand without limit. Between those two boundaries lies the entire arc of the cycle. Understanding this does not predict a date or a trigger. It changes how the present is interpreted. It reframes stability as conditional, growth as borrowed, normality as temporary. History shows that the people least harmed by these transitions are not those who deny them, nor those who panic at every signal.
They are those who recognize the pattern early enough to adjust expectations, behavior, and assumptions. Because when systems change, it is not the numbers that matter most. It is preparedness. This is why studying past cycles is not an academic exercise. It is a practical one. Every generation believes it lives at the end of history. Every system believes it has solved the problems of the past. Every cycle believes it is different, until it is not. Debt is not the villain of this story. It is the mechanism that reveals the limits of the system that depends on it. And once those limits are reached, no amount of delay can erase them, only expose them. If this perspective changed how you view debt, stability, or growth, then the cycle has already done its most important work. It has made the invisible visible. Because history does not repeat in exact detail. But when it comes to debt, it does something far more unsettling. It follows the same logic every time.